Hello and welcome to this story of my life. This one's a really interesting one. And, one of the reasons for recording stories of my life is not always to have upbeat, laughing, funny stories. Like my first three, I've decided to do some fairly funny stories. Me cleaning toilets, me the day that Armstrong landed on the moon, me getting caned twice on my first day of school. I mean, they're actually pretty funny when I stop and think about them. They're pretty funny stories, right? And there's a lesson to be learned from each of them if you're willing to listen. But as I said in my opening for the channel, one of the things I want to do is share some of the warts and all, because people will tell you, life is wonderful, life is great, you're going to go along and have this great life and all the rest of it when you're young. But life has its downs as well. Life has its sad moments. Life has its losses. And people are not taught to deal with that. We kind of shove that under the carpet, right? The bad things that will happen to you, we kind of don't talk about that to younger men. We certainly don't talk about it to children, and we don't talk about it much to younger men. And so one of the things that I want to do on this channel is just be honest about some of the bad things that have happened in my life and what I got from that. Because if I can be honest about some of the bad things that happened in my life and what I got from that, you too can expect some bad things to happen to your life. Perhaps from listening to my stories and what I have to say. Perhaps when these bad things in your life happen, some of which are inevitable, for example, your grandparents are going to die, right? Which is what this story is about. Your grandparents are going to die before you do, hopefully, right? You don't want to die before your grandparents. That's not the way of life. So your grandparents are going to die before you are, and that's inevitable. And how might you deal with that, right? So this story is the story of my grandmother, my father's mother, Nanna Nolan, and her passing. And it will be a fairly difficult story to tell, because I loved my grandmother very much. I have many stories about my grandmother, and I spent lots of time with my two grandmothers, and I loved every minute of it. So this is a story about the passing of my grandmother. As I've said, in 1995, I did the Landmark Forum with my wife, and I'll tell some stories from that a little later. But I repeated the forum towards the end of the year in, I think it was December. I think it was December 1995. I did it again for an entirely different reason. And I did it to learn how to sell things properly. And in one of the breaks, we were given an assignment, and the assignment was telephone somebody in your life who's really, really important to you, who you love, and tell them how you feel about them. That was the assignment. Call somebody in your life who you really, really love and tell them how you feel about them. And as that assignment was read out, we had an hour or so, or hour and a half, something like that. And we're supposed to get lunch as well. As that assignment was read out, I thought to myself, oh my God, my Nana is just down the road. She was dying of cancer, and she was about 1 kilometre from the centre where we were. She was literally 1 kilometre from the centre where we were. And I thought to myself, I can go and grab a cab down Oxford Street, and I can go and visit her, and not just call her, I can go and see her and tell her who she is to me. So like a madman, I ran out onto the middle of Oxford Street there in Sydney, flagged down a cab because it was Saturday afternoon. There's going to be a cab, very busy street, and I got a cab, and he took me to the hospice where my Nana was, and I went through the reception, found where she was, etc., and turned up in her room. Knocked on the door and told to come in, And two of my aunties were there, of course her daughters. Two of my aunties were there, Auntie Faye and Auntie Millicent were there with Nanna. And I nearly stopped because I thought, oh my God, I can't say this in front of my aunties. Okay, so Nanna was just sitting there in a chair. She knew she was dying. She knew she was not coming out of the hospice alive, and her daughters were there with her. It's a very touching scene. And then it looked up at me and said, "I'm very surprised to see you here. What are you here for?" And I said, I've come to tell you who you are for me. I said, I was just doing a class just down the road. I'm doing a class this weekend. I've told you about this class. I did it with my wife, Jennifer. I'm doing it again. And I have an assignment, and the assignment is go tell someone that you love how you feel about them. And I thought, well, you're right here. You're my Nanna. And you're right here. So I've come to tell you how I feel about you. And she looked at me and said, well, go ahead. And because she was sitting down, and I'm such a tall man, I decided rather than pull a seat up where I would still be looking down on her, I just, wow, this is harder than I thought. This is 30 years ago, 20 years ago. I got down on my knees in front of her, and I said to her, excuse me, I said to her, you're the greatest woman I know. I love you very much. You've been the greatest Nanna in the world to me. All the things we used to do together. We used to cook pickles together. Every autumn we would cook pickles together. Well, I just had to put that on pause for a second because I was, as I said, every autumn we used to make pickles with our Nanna Nolan. We'd get all the tomatoes that were too green to eat, and from all the tomato gardens in our relatives, etc., and we'd drive them around to Nanna Nolan's place and we'd make these green pickles. And Nanna Nolan made the world's best green pickles. And the funny thing is, haven't had her pickles for 30 years. I can taste them today. So, I said to her, we used to make pickles, we used to come to your house and play, and you're always so wonderful to me and kind to me, and you fed me, and it's times I stayed in your house. I just said, you've been the most wonderful, wonderful grandmother a boy could ever have. And I want you to know that. And, I said some more things. And of course, by this time, my two aunties who were sitting either side of me are crying. And Nanna is just emotionless. She just sat there. And when I finished, she just put her hand on my head and said, thank you. That's all she had to say. So I got up, I stood up, and my auntie, one of my aunties, Auntie Faye, said, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And I said, thank you. I have to go now. I have to go back to my class. And I got in the cab and I went back to my class. And my Nanna died. Wow, this is harder than I thought. So yeah, a few weeks later my Nanna died. And then of course, the problem was, who was to perform her eulogy? From the family, who was to perform her eulogy? And the tradition in our family was, of course, the eldest son would perform a eulogy, but the eldest grandchild would also perform a eulogy for the dear departed, whoever it might be. And My father, being the eldest son, decided that he would break with tradition and put it to the grandchildren that they should select who they want to speak. And I don't know why he broke with that tradition, but that's what he did. And so he called around the grandchildren and asked the grandchildren to please tell him. He tallied up the votes. Everyone got one vote. He said, I voted for the eldest grandchild, who was actually my older brother. But everyone got one vote. And they were asked, who do you want to present the grandchildren's eulogy? And Dad tallied up the votes and I won. If you can call that winning. So he came to me and he said, the votes are that the other grandchildren want you to do the eulogy. And I said, okay, what greater honour could I have than my peers, my fellow grandchildren, want me to speak about their grandmother at her funeral. I couldn't believe it when my father came to me and told me that. I was actually quite shocked. So then once it was known that I was going to do the eulogy, my other peers came around and told me what they wanted. Told me what they wanted in the eulogy. And so I spent 2 days writing her eulogy, writing what I wanted to say. And I knew I would have to have it on paper, because I knew that this was going to be the toughest speech I ever gave. I had given many speeches in my life up until that point. I was a very good public speaker. I'm a great public speaker. But giving the grandchildren's eulogy at my grandmother's funeral, I didn't know how I was going to handle that, but handle it I was going to. And a lot of my other cousins said to me, thank you very much for doing this, because I couldn't. For the obvious reason, it would be an overwhelming experience and event for anybody to eulogize their grandmother, as it turned out for me. So on the day, of her funeral, more than 1,000 people showed up. The old men told me they'd never seen the like of it in the history of the tower. The funeral was held in the largest church in Wagga, which seated about 400 people. So there was about 600 people outside. Luckily it was summertime and it was a fine day. And they hung loudspeakers out on the trees, out on the front of the church. And so the only people who could make it into the church, of course, were the families and the closest friends of my Nanna. The 600 or so other people, who of course were friends, understood and accepted that they needed to stay out the front, outside, and understood that was their place. All the football teams in the region sent along delegates to express their condolences to us. Wow, this is... I keep hitting pause to give myself a break. Wow, this is harder than I thought. So I hope you like this, boys. Yes, all the football teams sent along delegates to express their condolences to us. As I said, the old men said they'd never seen the like of it in their life. They'd never been at a funeral like this. When you have a man 80 years of age look you in the eye and say, "There's never been a funeral like this in town," and your grandmother was very loved, and she was. It was a huge funeral, huge funeral. So anyhow, obviously, it was an overwhelming event for me. I was, at the time, I was 32, just turned 32, and I was a very successful man, and it was my job to stand up and communicate to 1,000 people what it was that us grandchildren felt about our grandmother. And I can tell you, that speech was the toughest speech I ever did. I did eulogise my other grandmother on the event of her death a little later, but that speech, that day, it was tough. It was a very tough speech. So I got up, and my eulogy was about 15 minutes. Might have been 20 minutes. It could have been 5 hours, for all I knew. I had it written down, and as I looked out onto the congregation, knowing there were 600 more people outside, it was a tough speech to make. So I stood up and looked out on the congregation, and I delivered this eulogy. And it was, I think, in my opinion, the best speech I ever delivered in my life. I did do a great speech when I was 17, but of course I was 17, and the topic was very different. But on the event of doing the eulogy for the first time for your grandmother's death, giving that speech was the greatest honour I'd ever had bestowed on me in my life. It was a great speech. It was such a great speech, and everyone was crying. I don't think there was a dry eye in the place by the end of my speech. And as I got about halfway through it, I myself was overcome and overwhelmed with emotion, and basically I cried for the second half of my speech. I didn't bother drying my tears. I just stood there and delivered the speech while I cried. It was a very tough thing to do. For a start, it was hard to read the words, right? So when I finished and walked out, I finished my speech, and I decided that I had to go out for a breath of fresh air. And I walked out, and some of the old men, my grandmother's peers, the old men were crying, had tears coming down their eyes. One of them walked up to me, slapped me on the back, and said, "I have never heard a man speak like that." And I just simply said, "Thank you." And a number of the old men just went, "Great speech. Thank you." And I said thank you to them all. And it was such a, everybody knew that she was dying. Everybody knew that she had cancer, that it was not operable, and that she was going to die. But when you get 1,000 people in a town of 35,000 people, when you get 1,000 people to turn out for a funeral on a working day, you know that you're farewelling one of the most loved members of the community. And that's who my Nana was. She was one of the most loved members of her community. She was a great woman. I say to women today that you could learn a lot from my grandmother. There was a few women who had it as tough as my grandmother had it, and carried herself with the grace that my grandmother carried herself with. She was a most remarkable woman. If women were still like that in the West, men would be lining up to marry them. They really would be. So that was the experience of the service, and yet the worst was yet to come when we actually had to bury her. And so the procession, of course, disrupted traffic. There was over 200 cars in the procession. More than 500 or 600 people came to the burial. Not everyone who goes to the church goes to the burial, but I think it was like 500 or 600 people at the burial. And of course, as grandchildren, we were front and centre at the burial. And of course, that was very difficult, watching my grandmother's coffin be put, my grandmother's coffin with my grandmother in it, being buried. So that was that experience. As we left the burial, one of the most important aspects of the day happened. One of the most important things of the day occurred. And that was, I was walking back to my car because my wife and my children were there. And I was walking back to my car, and I was walking next to my father. And my father said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Really? Sorry for what?" And he said, "I'm sorry for the eulogy. I thought you could handle it." And I said, "What do you mean you thought I could handle it?" And he said, "I didn't mean to see you cry." And I looked at him. I stopped. We'd been walking together saying this. And so I stopped to force my dad to stop and turn around and look at me. So he said, "I didn't mean to see you cry," and I stopped. And so he stopped and he turned around and looked at me, and I said to him, "Do you not yet realise the eulogy was perfect?" And he looked at me and he nodded, and we turned around and we continued on, because the eulogy was perfect. He had in his mind that, big boys don't cry, that if you're delivering a eulogy for your grandmother, you shouldn't be crying over it, right? Was his way of being brought up. But of course, my way of being brought up was, I'm as tough as they come, and sometimes big boys cry. And crying on the event, being overwhelmed with emotion and crying on the event of delivering the eulogy for your grandmother, I viewed as perfect. And I viewed that nobody would think lesser of me for that. Okay? Indeed, I think people think more of me from the response that I got from particularly the older men. They were pleased and happy that I was able to express myself exactly as I felt comfortable, delivering the toughest speech of my life, the eulogy from my grandmother, the first time that it happened. Okay, so for all you boys out there, more than likely, your grandparents are going to pass away before you do. Certainly, I hope that's the case. the natural order of things is, your grandparents' natural order of things, they should pass away before you do. But that can be a difficult and overwhelming experience because a lot of us are very close to our grandmothers, very close to our grandfathers. I was certainly very close to my grandfather, Frank Trainor. So that's my story. Take away from it what you like. As you can tell from my voice and how many times, I don't know if you all noticed how many times I hit pause there, but I've hit pause more than a dozen times in getting this on the record. Okay? So I hope you appreciate this one, because this is pretty hard to do. I'm not sure. I mean, I've started out with the intention of doing a few of these. I'm not quite sure how much I like these. So feedback, comments, votes. Tell me what you think of sharing a story that difficult to share, and tell me what it means for you. Is it something that you want, or is it something that you think, no, these things are best left unsaid? I'd be interested in the opinion of you young lads about that. Okay? So thank you very much for listening.